You are standing on gravel that used to be a floor. Feel that. The stones under your boots are the kind a county drops from the back of a truck when there's nothing left worth paving properly. Loose, gray, shifting a little when the wind pushes through. Behind you, a feed store with vinyl siding the color of old teeth sells fence posts and 50-pound bags of grain to men who don't remember what stood here before. But you remember. You are 61 years old, and you remember the smell of grease that never fully left this patch of dirt, even after they tore the building down, even after 4 winters of frost heave and 1 summer of wildfire smoke drifting down from the ridge. You remember a boy, 14 years old. Bones showing at the wrist the way they show on something that hasn't eaten right in weeks. Barefoot in August, which tells you something before he ever opens his mouth, because a boy who has shoes and won't wear them is making a choice, and a boy who doesn't have shoes has had a choice made for him. You remember he wouldn't look at you at first. He looked at the dog you'd fed a strip of jerky to, a mutt with a torn ear that had been living under the diner's collapsed porch, same as he had. And you remember thinking, that's not a stray dog problem. That's a boy who has learned that eye contact costs something he can't afford to spend. You gave him a sandwich. You didn't ask him anything. You have learned, over 3.5 decades of riding, that the asking is the easiest way to lose a person who is one wrong question from disappearing into the tree line and never being found again. He ate like he was ashamed of being hungry. And then, without you asking, that's the part that still sits behind your sternum, like a stone you swallowed wrong. He said the thing that split the morning open. She's not missing. I know exactly where she is. 9 words, whispered so quiet you had to lean toward him to catch it, the way you'd lean toward a man confessing something in a hospital bed. You didn't understand yet what those words would cost, or what they would ask of 22 men who wore the same patch you did and had sworn the same vows. You didn't know, standing in that gravel lot 4 years ago, that a folded piece of paper carried against a boy's ribs for weeks would end up changing the shape of your club, your family, your Sundays, for good. You're going to want the whole thing. Not the version people tell at the clubhouse now, shorthand and legend. The real one, hour by hour, the 48 that mattered most. Stay till the end. This one's worth it. Before any of that, though, you have to go back to where it actually started. Not this lot. Not this feed store. The diner, when it was still standing, and still had a roof over the boy's head. 2 years before that gravel lot, the diner still had a roof, and the roof still had a sign, Black Ridge Eats. Half its letters burned out so long ago that at night it just read Bla-K-Re-E-S, like a place that had given up finishing its own sentence. He remembers the month because the heat that August was the kind that sat on your chest instead of passing over it, 99 degrees by 10 in the morning, the asphalt gone soft enough to hold a boot print. He was on a supply run that day, nothing dramatic, nothing that belonged in a story anyone would tell twice. Filters for the clubhouse fryer, a case of oil, 40 miles of 2-lane between Iron Ridge and Black Ridge, the kind of drive where a man's mind wanders because the road doesn't require the rest of him. He'd ridden past that diner 100 times without seeing it. That was the truth of it, plain and a little shameful. A shuttered building is easy to stop noticing, the way a scar stops feeling like a wound and starts feeling like skin. Plywood in 2 of the 3 front windows. A padlock rusted the color of dried blood. Weeds working their way up through the cracks in the lot, like they were trying to reclaim something that had never really belonged to men in the first place. What made him slow down that particular afternoon? He still can't answer that cleanly, even now, even after telling this story enough times that it should have hardened into something with edges. Call it 30 years of scanning rooms for what didn't belong. Call it the training that never turns off, the same instinct that used to check doorways and tree lines, now reduced to checking gas station lots and dead diners on a supply run. Whatever it was, his eyes caught on a shape at the side of the building, low to the ground, in the thin blade of shade the propane tank threw. A dog, not his, not anybody's from the look of it, ribs like fingers laid flat under a rug, one ear chewed ragged at the tip, and crouched beside it, feeding it something out of a paper wrapper with the kind of care you'd use on something breakable, was a boy who could not have weighed more than the dog did. He didn't stop the bike right away. That's the part he circles back to most, in the years since. The 3-4 seconds where he could have just kept riding, filters and oil, and a road that didn't ask anything of him. He eased off the throttle instead. Let the bike coast down through the heat shimmer toward that strip of shade, gravel popping under the tires like something waking up. The boy didn't run. That was the first thing that told him this wasn't an ordinary skinny kid feeding a stray. Kids ran. This one just went still, the way something goes still when it has already decided running never works. He cut the engine 10 feet out and sat there a moment with his hands still on the grips, the way a man sits still around something skittish he doesn't want to spook. The heat came up off the asphalt in waves you could almost hear, and somewhere behind the propane tank a screen door banged against nothing, over and over, in a wind that wasn't strong enough to be called wind. The boy watched him the way you'd watch weather. Not afraid, exactly. Calculating. It was the dog that did it, or maybe the boy's hands, the careful way they tore the bread into pieces small enough for a mouth that had learned not to trust anything large coming toward it fast. He'd seen hands like that before. His own, once, a long time back, in a kitchen in a house he did not let himself picture anymore, tearing bread the same way for a dog that didn't exist, because there had been nothing else in that house gentle enough to practice tenderness on. He was 11 that year. Cold enough in November that the trucker who found him behind a Sinclair station outside Weatherford had to peel him off the concrete like something frozen to a truck bed. He didn't remember the man's face anymore. That had gone the way most faces went, worn smooth by 30-some years of not looking at it directly. What stayed was the smell of the cab, diesel and cold coffee, and a flannel jacket thrown over him that weighed more than he did. What stayed was the man not asking him a single question for the first 4 hours, just driving, letting the boy decide in his own time whether silence was a place he could rest in. Nobody had ever given him that before. The not asking, the room to just be broken without an accounting of it. He had spent 30 years making sure nobody ever had to know that story came from him, told it to exactly one person, and that person was dead now, buried under a stone with a rose on it 2 counties over, and some part of him had assumed the story got buried too. But here it was, crouched in the shade of a propane tank behind a dead diner, feeding a stray dog bread with the careful, economical tenderness of someone who has learned that gentleness is a resource, and you don't waste it. He got off the bike slow. No sudden weight in his boots on the gravel, no reach toward anything. Just a big man in a leather vest going down onto one knee at a distance that wasn't a threat, the way you'd approach the dog and not the boy, because he understood, some cellar-deep part of him understood, that right now they were the same animal. "That your dog?" he said. The boy's eyes didn't move off him for a full 3 seconds. "No," he said. "He's nobody's." Boone nodded slow, like that was the most reasonable thing he'd heard all week. "Neither was I, once," he said, and watched what that did to the boy's face. He didn't come back the next day. That was the first rule he'd learned a long time ago, from a man who was gone now too. You don't corner what you're trying to earn. So he rode past instead, twice, 3 times over the course of a week, slow enough to see, and fast enough not to be seen seeing. The dog was there each time. Different times, different light, same dog. Ribs like a washboard, tail low, circling the propane tank like it was the only fixed point in a moving world. And the boy fed it. Not generously, carefully. A crust here, a strip of something unidentifiable there, portioned out like a man rationing ammunition. He noticed the jug first, half buried in the weeds behind a cinder block, wedged so the sun wouldn't cook it, capped tight. Somebody had taught that boy to hide water before they'd taught him anything else, or nobody had taught him at all, and he'd figured it out on his own, which was worse. He noticed the flinch second. A truck backfired 2 blocks over on a Tuesday, and the boy went still, the way a rabbit goes still, every muscle deciding at once whether the field was worth running across. But he didn't run. That was the thing that kept surfacing in the back of his mind, like a coin turning over and over in deep water. Other strays ran. This one held ground he had no right to and no claim on, because somewhere in his calculations, Staying put behind a dead diner was safer than whatever running led back to. Days moved like that. Short, hard little increments, each one adding a line to a picture he didn't want to finish drawing. A boy who ate less than the dog. A boy who slept, he was fairly sure, somewhere behind that propane tank, in a nest of cardboard he'd glimpsed once, through a gap in the fencing, and never mentioned to anyone. A boy who lied, when asked by the one gas station clerk who bothered asking, that he was waiting on his uncle. Nobody's uncle came. He told the clubhouse only the bones of it. Kid, diner, dog, don't crowd him. His brothers took that the way they took most things from him, without question, which was its own kind of dangerous, because it meant whatever came next, they'd follow him into it blind. He didn't sleep well those nights. Lay in the dark running the ledger of it, the jug, the crusts, the flinch that never turned into flight, and kept landing on the same arithmetic he'd landed on decades ago as a kid himself, before a stranger's hand had closed around the back of his collar and hauled him sideways out of one life into another. Some kids ran because running was the only power they had left. This one wasn't running. Which meant, he understood on the fourth night, staring at a ceiling that offered no answers, that something out there scared him worse than starving. The gravel lot hadn't changed much in the seconds it took him to remember all that. He stood with his boots planted where the diner's back step used to be, though the step itself was long gone, hauled off with everything else when they'd torn the building down to its foundation, and then torn out the foundation too. A feed store stood there now, aluminum-sided, cheerful in a way that felt almost like an insult to the ground beneath it. He reached into his vest without looking, the way a man reaches for his own pulse, and found the fold of paper tucked where it always was, against his ribs, close enough to feel his heartbeat move it. He didn't take it out. He didn't need to. He knew the shape of every crease by feel alone, the way the top fold had gone soft as cloth from being opened and closed so many times, the way the bottom corner had worn thin as a moth's wing, and he'd had to reinforce it once with a strip of packing tape, badly, like a man who didn't want to admit he was preserving something. It was a photocopy of a photocopy by now, the ink gone the gray-brown of old coffee, but he could still read every line of it in the dark if he had to. He had, more than once. Other men carried rosaries. He carried this. He let his hand fall away from his vest and looked at the new siding of the feed store, at the trucks angled in the lot, at a woman loading a 50-pound bag of scratch feed into her tailgate without seeming to notice the man standing 40 feet away, with his eyes somewhere else entirely, in another decade. He'd read once that grief has a half-life, that it thins with distance the way radiation does. He didn't believe that. Some things didn't thin, they just went quiet, folded themselves down small enough to carry, and waited. Back then, on the fourth sleepless night, he'd made a decision he hadn't told anyone yet. Not the club, not his old lady, not the boy himself. He'd decided he was going back to that gap in the fence with something better than a sandwich in his hand. He was going back with a question that didn't leave room for another lie. He shifted his weight, and the gravel under his boots made the same small grinding sound gravel always makes, indifferent to what men remember standing on top of it. Somewhere behind the feed store a dog barked twice and went quiet, and for a half a second his whole body went still, listening, the way it had gone still 100 times behind a diner that didn't exist anymore, waiting to see what kind of silence was coming next. The gravel gave way to memory before his boots ever moved, and he let it take him back, because that was the only direction that had ever made sense to him anyway. 4 months earlier, late July, 96 degrees at 8 in the evening, the kind of heat that didn't break with the sun, just sat on the town like a hand. He'd walked up to the gap in the chain link with a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, nothing else. No clipboard, no badge, no questions loaded and ready to fire. He'd learned that much in 30 years of finding wounded things. You didn't walk toward them with your hands full of anything they had to answer for. The boy had been sitting in the exact spot as the night before, knees drawn up, back against the cinder block, and when he saw the sandwich he didn't move for a long 5 seconds. Just looked at it the way a man looks at a phone ringing at 3 a.m., trying to decide if answering it will cost him more than not answering. Then he took it, fast, like he expected it to be pulled back. He ate without looking up, small bites, chewing slow even though his hands weren't slow at all. And the president crouched down on the far side of the gap, close enough to talk, far enough not to crowd. "You been out here a while?" The boy didn't answer that. He finished the sandwich, folded the wax paper into a small, careful square, the way you fold something you might need again. "Where do you sleep?" "Here." "Every night?" A pause. Then, flat. "Since April." The president did the math without wanting to. April to July. 90, maybe 120 nights behind a shuttered building nobody was coming back to fix, in a town that had 2 working streetlights and a sheriff's office that closed at 6. Alone? The boy's jaw worked once, like he was deciding whether that word deserved a real answer or a smaller one. "I got a system," he said instead. "That's not what I asked." The boy looked at him then, straight on, and there was nothing childlike in it, no fear looking for rescue, no performance of sadness meant to move a stranger, just a flat, exhausted steadiness that the president recognized the way you recognize a scar shaped like your own. "Nobody's looking for me," the boy said. "That's the part that works out for everybody." He said it like a fact he'd made peace with a long time ago, the way a man might say the water's cold before he steps into it, not bitter. Just accurate. The president stayed crouched there a moment longer, feeling the heat come up off the asphalt behind him, feeling something in his chest that he hadn't let move in years shift half an inch, and did not yet ask about the sister. Not that night. That question, he understood, was going to cost the boy something to answer, and a man learns, if he lives long enough, which doors you don't kick open the first time you find them. He let 2 nights pass before he asked it. That was the rule he'd made for himself, somewhere between the war and the divorce, and all the years of learning that people don't hand you the truth. You have to leave a door open long enough that they walk through it on their own legs. The diner regular, a woman who ran the register at the gas station 2 blocks down, gray hair, forearms like rope, had mentioned it in passing, not knowing she was handing him something. Said the boy used to come in with a little girl. Braids, maybe 9, 10, hadn't seen her in a while. Figured she'd gone to stay with somebody. He filed it away the way he filed everything now, quiet, no reaction on his face, and on the 3rd night he brought 2 coffees instead of 1 and set the second one down on the curb like it was nothing. "Heard you had a sister running with you for a while." The boy's hand didn't move toward the cup. "She's staying with family." Flat, practiced. The kind of sentence that had been said enough times it had worn smooth, like a stone carried in a pocket. "Which family?" "Family. Family." He let the silence sit there. Somewhere behind them a truck downshifted on the highway, engine braking long and low, and the sound rolled out over the flat dark land and disappeared. "She missing?" He hadn't meant to say the word that plain. It came out of him before he'd decided to let it, the way certain words do when a man's been holding a shape in his mouth too long without naming it. The boy's jaw moved. Just once. "She's not." His voice caught on the second word and didn't come back smooth. It cracked down the middle, like old vinyl, and for half a second, the flat, exhausted steadiness broke, and something much younger looked out from behind it, something that had been holding its breath for a long time and hadn't expected to be asked to stop. "She's not missing." He said it again, quieter, like repeating it might weld the crack back shut. "She's not missing. I know where she is. I know exactly where she is." His hands had come together in his lap, lace tight, knuckles pale under the dirt. "Okay," the president said, and didn't push further, though everything in him wanted to. He had learned that too, somewhere, that the second question is always the one that costs the most, and a scared thing will bolt if you reach for it twice in the same breath. He picked up his coffee, let the boy have his silence back. But he'd seen it now, the thing under the flat voice, the same thing he remembered from a stranger's truck cab 30 years before, a hand on his own shoulder, a question he hadn't been ready to answer either. He knew the shape of a boy carrying something too heavy to set down and too dangerous to hand to the wrong person. He just didn't know yet how heavy, or how far away, or what waited for them both at the end of that 2 counties of dark road. The gravel lot behind the feed store holds the heat of the afternoon long after the sun has started its slide toward the ridgeline, and the president stands there now, boots planted where a curb used to be, remembering how there had been an actual curb once, cracked concrete gone gray with age, and how he and the boy had sat on it until the light went the color of a healing bruise, and then further, into nothing. He hadn't said much. That was the part people never understood when he told it later, the part his brothers still didn't fully believe, that the biggest thing he did that evening was nothing at all. He'd finished his coffee, he'd let it go cold in the cup between his boots. The boy hadn't moved except to draw his knees up tighter, and the diner sign had buzzed once, twice, and died for good sometime after 7, the way it did most nights, unreliable as everything else in that town. He remembers thinking about the trucker. 31 years gone now, though the man's face had never quite blurred the way most faces did with time, a flannel shirt gone soft at the elbows, hands like dry roots on a wheel, radio turned down so low it was just a hum under the engine noise. That man hadn't asked him anything either, not at first. Hadn't reached twice, had just let a scared kid sit in the cab of a stranger's truck for 40 minutes without demanding an accounting of every bruise, every lie, every reason a boy might have for standing on the shoulder of a highway at 11 o'clock with no shoes. Silence, the trucker had taught him without ever saying so, was a door left open. You didn't have to walk through it. You just had to know it wasn't going to close on you the second you moved. So he'd given the boy that same door. Sat with him as the parking lot emptied of light, as a possum crossed somewhere near the dumpsters, as the temperature dropped enough that he'd thought about the jacket in his saddlebag and decided against offering it. Too much, too soon, a kindness that might read as a hook. He'd let the boy set the pace. Let the boy decide, mile by silent mile, how much more of himself he was willing to hand over to a stranger in a leather cut who smelled like motor oil and gas station coffee. Somewhere near full dark, the boy had spoken again, not about the sister, about the dog. Said it liked to sleep under the propane tank because the metal held the day's heat longest into the night. The president hadn't answered, just nodded, like it was information worth having, filed it away the way he'd file away everything else that boy would tell him, in pieces, over the 2 days that followed, small, sideways, offered only when the silence had proven itself trustworthy enough to deserve them. The president remembered the exact moment the boy's voice changed, not louder, steadier, like something that had been held underwater long enough, finally broke the surface, and remembered how air worked. It came without warning, the way true things usually do. They were sitting on the same curb, the concrete still holding a little of the day's heat, the diner sign above them dark and dead, except for the single letter that still buzzed faintly when the wind hit it right. The boy had been picking at a loose thread on his shoe, not looking up. And then he said it, flat, like reciting an address he'd memorized so hard it had lost its danger. She's not missing. The president didn't move, didn't lean in. He'd learned that much already, that leaning in was its own kind of threat. She's at my aunt's, the boy said. Coyote Flat, 2 counties over. Somewhere behind them, a screen door banged in the wind, and neither of them turned toward it. She's been there since March, the boy said. Since he stopped, started again, smaller, since it got too dangerous to be near him. The president sat with that. Let it settle the way dust settles after a truck passes, slow, in its own time, no rushing it back down. Who's him? He said. Not a question, really, just leaving a space in case the boy wanted to fill it. The boy didn't fill it, not yet. But something in his shoulders came down half an inch, like a weight had been passed off, even if only to be carried by someone else for a while. I told everyone she's staying with a friend from school, the boy said. Told the lady at the church that. Told the cop who stopped me behind the Texaco that. Told you that, first night. I know. You believed me? No, the president said. The boy looked at him then, first time in an hour, eyes catching what little light the dead sign still gave off. Then why didn't you push? The president thought about how to answer that honestly, which took longer than the boy probably expected, because honesty always did. Because a kid holding a lie that tight, he said, is usually holding something under it he's more scared of than getting caught. The boy's jaw worked once, twice, like he was chewing on whether that was safe to agree with. "She's scared of him coming back," the boy finally said. "That's why I never told nobody where. Figured the fewer people knew the address, the safer she was." The president nodded slowly, filing that too, next to the dog and the propane tank and the possum and every other small true thing the boy had traded him for silence. "Coyote Flat," he said again, testing the shape of it in his mouth like a man checking a bridge before he put his weight on it. The boy didn't answer, but he didn't take it back either. And somewhere past the dead sign, past the empty lot, past the dark highway running north, the president felt the shape of the next 2 days start to arrange itself before either of them had agreed to it out loud. The president was still turning Coyote Flat over when the boy bent down and did something that stopped the thought cold. He reached into his own boot, past the sock gone gray with wear, and came up with a fold of paper so soft with handling it looked like cloth. He didn't hand it over. He held it, both hands, the way a man holds something he has decided in advance he will die before he loses. "You don't got to read this," the boy said. "I just need you to know it's real, that I ain't making none of it up." The president didn't reach for it. He'd learned that much in 51 years, that a hand extended too fast toward something a person is protecting will make them close around it forever. He kept his own hands loose on his knees and waited, and the waiting was its own kind of language, one the boy seemed to understand better than most grown men did. Slowly, the fold came open. Not all the way. Enough. Water had gotten into it at some point. Old water, dried into a stain that had turned the ink at the corners the color of weak tea, and the crease lines had gone soft and fibrous, the paper close to giving out entirely, like a bone that had been broken and healed, and broken again in the same place. The boy angled it toward the parking lot light, careful, the way you'd angle a photograph you were afraid the sun might finish ruining. The president read what he could without asking to hold it. Guardianship. Temporary. A name he recognized as the boy's own trailing into a signature line, and above it another name, a woman's hand, looping and unsteady in a way that made him think of hospital forms filled out under fluorescent lights by someone whose hand wasn't fully hers to command anymore. A date, an aunt's name, printed clean beneath a line that said, "Guardian, Minor Children." "My mama signed it," the boy said, before he was asked. "Before they took her in. She wasn't. She couldn't think straight no more by then, but she made 'em let her sign it. Made the nurse witness it and everything." His thumb moved once over the signature, not touching the ink itself, just tracing the air above it like he'd worn a groove there from doing it 100 times before. "It's the only paper says, my sister's supposed to be somewhere, says it's legal, says nobody can just come take her back if I ain't there to show it." He folded it again, along the same soft creases, and it went back into the boot the way a man holsters something he trusts more than he trusts most people. The president sat with that a long moment, the parking lot light humming overhead, the dead diner sign ticking faintly as it cooled. "2 counties," he said finally. "You said Coyote Flats 2 counties over." The boy nodded once, watching him now the way a man watches a bridge he's already decided to cross, whether or not it holds. The president who is telling this now, years later, still remembers the exact pitch of the hum from that parking lot light, the way some sounds get stapled to a memory and never come loose. He remembers thinking, "The system." 2 words the boy wouldn't say out loud that night, not once, though they sat behind everything he did say. It came out sideways, in pieces, the way true things do when a kid's been holding them alone too long. The mother wasn't missing either. She was 3 hours north, in a state facility with a name that sounded like a park and wasn't one, committed in March. Voluntary, the paperwork said, though the boy didn't trust that word any more than he trusted most adults. "She hears things," he said the boyfriend's voice, "sometimes when he ain't even there. Doctor said it's the drugs he had her on, said it a long time before it got that bad." He said it flat, not ashamed, just tired, the way a man gets tired of carrying a fact so long it stops feeling like news. The president asked why he hadn't told anyone, any teacher, any cop. Any one of the 100 adults a 14-year-old runs past in a small town every week. The boy looked at him like the question was the strange part. Because then they take her, he said. Not mama, my sister. They come get her and put her in a house with strangers and call it placement. And maybe it's fine, maybe it ain't. But either way, I ain't there. And mama's paper don't mean nothing once a judge decides different. He'd learned that lesson somewhere. Not from a book. From watching it happen to somebody, or almost happen to himself. The president never did get the whole shape of it, only the fear it left behind, precise and load-bearing, like rebar in concrete you can't see but know is holding the weight. So you kept her hid, the president said. So I kept her safe, the boy said, and there was no defiance in it, just a correction, offered the way a man corrects a fact on a form. The president sat with that a long time. He thought about his own mother's hands, 30-some years gone now, and a stranger's voice in a doorway saying, "You're coming with me, son." And how for years he'd hated that stranger before he understood him. He didn't say any of that to the boy, not yet. That part of the story would come later, on a different night, over a different silence. What he said instead was small, and it was the only thing he had. "Nobody's taking her anywhere she doesn't want to go," he said, "not while I'm standing here." The boy studied him the way he'd studied the folded paper, like a man deciding whether an object could bear weight before he put his whole self on it. Then he reached for his phone, dead-screened for weeks, and asked if the president had a charger in his truck. The truck had a charger coiled in the glove box, cracked at the seam from years of heat, and the president held it out the way you'd hand a man his crutch back. No ceremony, just necessity passed hand to hand. The boy's phone woke slow, the screen stuttering through a dead battery's ghost images before it settled into light. He didn't call anyone. He scrolled, thumb moving with the deliberate care of a man counting money he didn't have much of, until he found what he was looking for and turned the screen so the president could see. A photograph. An old woman on a porch step, cardigan buttoned wrong, one eye clouded milk-white with what looked like cataract gone untreated, her hand resting on a girl's shoulder the way a fence post leans on a girl, for the fence post's own sake, not the girl's. "That's my great-aunt," the boy said, "Ruth." The president asked how she was keeping a 9-year-old, and the boy's jaw did the thing it had done all evening, tightening like a rope taking strain. "She's not keeping her good," he said. "She's just keeping her." He said Ruth was 78 and living on a fixed check that didn't fix much, that her hip had gone bad 2 winters back, and she moved through her own kitchen like she was crossing ice, that her breathing had a catch in it now that hadn't been there before, a catch the boy described, with the specific dread of someone who has learned to listen for it in the dark. He said there was no extra bed, so the girl slept on a couch with a broken spring wrapped in a beach towel. He said Ruth loved his sister the way old women love the last thing left to love, fiercely and past her own strength, and that she had taken the girl in, not because anyone asked her to, but because no one else had, and because she remembered, dimly, in pieces, the way the very old remember, what it was to be a child nobody came looking for. "She's not stealing her," the boy said. "She's just old, and scared, and she thinks if she calls anybody, they'll take Kayla and put her with strangers, and Ruth dies not knowing where she ended up." The president looked at the photograph again, at the old woman's clouded eye, at the girl's shoulder gone stiff under that thin, protective hand, and understood he was not looking at a crime. He was looking at 2 people doing the only math they knew how to do with the numbers they'd been given, and getting an answer that kept a child fed but not safe, sheltered but not seen, by anyone with the power to fix what needed fixing. "She got a phone, your great-aunt?" he asked. The boy shook his head. "Just the neighbor's landline. And she won't use that unless it's dying." The president sat with that for a moment, feeling the shape of a problem that didn't have a clean edge anywhere on it. The clubhouse still smelled like the afternoon's coffee when he walked in that night, boots loud on the concrete, jacket still carrying the heat of the road. Word had gone out the way it always went out, not a phone tree, not an announcement, just a few words to the right men who told the next right men, and by 9 o'clock the long table in the back room had filled the way it filled for funerals and for votes, which in his experience were the only 2 things that ever brought every patch in at once. He didn't sit at the head of it. He set the folded custody paper down in the middle instead, smoothing it flat with the side of his hand, the way a man smooths a bedsheet, and let it sit there a moment before he spoke. The retired lawyer, a thin man with a quart's worth of stillness in him, the kind that came from 30 years of watching families come apart across a table, reached for it first, reading glasses low, thumb moving down the page like he was checking it for a pulse. "This is real," he said finally. "Filed, signed, never revoked." He looked up. "Somebody sat on this a long time. An old woman with bad eyes and no phone," the president said, "and a girl who's been calling her Aunt Ruth because that was safer than calling her nobody." Nobody laughed. A few men shifted, the way men shift when a room gets heavier than they expected on a Tuesday. "I'm not asking for a vote," he said, and he meant it plain. No theater in it. "I'm not asking anybody to ride into something they don't understand. I'm asking what we do with a paper that says a child belongs somewhere safe, and a system too slow or too blind to go get her, and a boy sleeping behind a dead diner because he didn't trust that system either." The room held its silence the particular way it held silence before someone said the thing that mattered. "You want it done quiet or done right?" someone finally asked. "Both," the president said. "Quiet enough nobody panics, right enough it holds up if anybody ever asks." The lawyer was already turning the paper over, looking for a filing date, a county seal, anything that would let him build a wall around what they were about to do so it couldn't be knocked down later. "I'll need the boy's statement," he said, "in writing. And I'll need to call in a favor with a judge who owes me for something he'd rather forget. You'll have both by morning." Around the table, chairs began to scrape back, not in haste, but in the unhurried certainty of men who had done hard things before and understood the doing of them started with paperwork, not fists. Someone was already reaching for a road atlas. Someone else asked how many trucks they'd need, how many men could be spared without leaving the clubhouse thin. The president watched them move and felt something settle in his chest that hadn't settled there in years. Not certainty exactly, but the next best thing to it. The lawyer had not moved from the table. He held the paper closer to the lamp, tilting it the way a man checks a bill for a watermark, and the light came through thin enough that the president could see the fibers of it, the places where a fold had been made and unmade. So many times the crease had gone soft and gray. 14 years old and carrying a document like that in a coat pocket for weeks, folding it at night, unfolding it in the morning to make sure it was still real. "It's valid," the lawyer said finally. "Custody transfer, notarized, county seals legitimate. I checked it against the format they used 2 years back, before they changed the letterhead." He set it down flat on the table, smoothing it with 2 fingers like he was closing a wound. "But it's incomplete. There's no enforcement order attached. This gets you standing. It doesn't get you a warrant, and it doesn't get you a deputy standing next to you when you knock on that door. So we bring one. You bring the wrong one. This goes sideways in about 4 seconds." The lawyer looked around the table, not unkindly, the way a man looks at people he respects but has to disappoint anyway. "You show up with 22 men and no paper trail, and if that boyfriend so much as raises his voice, you're the story tomorrow. Not him, you. Bikers storm a property, remove a minor, no law enforcement present. That headline writes itself, and it doesn't matter that every word of what you did was right. Doesn't matter that the paper's real. People don't read past the first sentence." Someone down the table said something low, something about how the system had already had its chance and used it to lose a 14-year-old boy behind a diner for 3 months. But the lawyer didn't argue that. He just nodded, slow, like a man agreeing with a truth that didn't change the math. "I'm not saying don't go," he said. "I'm saying don't go blind. Give me till morning. I make the call, I get someone with a badge who'll ride along instead of ride against you, and this stops being a story about bikers and starts being a story about a family getting a kid back where he belongs." He looked at the president directly then, and there was something almost gentle in it. The kind of gentleness that comes from a man who has spent a career watching good intentions get filed as felonies. "You've waited this long. The girl's been safe enough to still be there. One more night won't undo what you're trying to do." The president looked at the paper again, at the soft gray crease running through the middle of it like a scar, and thought about a boy sitting behind a shuttered diner not sleeping, checking a pocket every hour, just to be sure the only proof he had hadn't disappeared in the night. One more night, he said. Not two. The lawyer's copy machine had been the last stop before dawn, and the president remembered the sound of it more than he remembered sleeping. That low mechanical hum in an empty office at 1 in the morning, the smell of warm toner, the original paper laid flat under glass like something being x-rayed. He'd folded the copy into his vest pocket and left the original in a manila envelope with instructions written on it in block letters, the kind of handwriting men use when they don't trust their voice to carry the weight of what they're saying. By 4:30, the lot behind the clubhouse was full of engines that weren't running yet. That was the part he remembered clearest. Not the noise, but the absence of it. 22 men moving in the dark with the particular quiet of people who have done violent things and learned, late, the value of doing them softly. Boots on gravel. The clink of a chain being looped and tied down in the bed of a truck that had no business hauling what it was about to haul. A truck they loaded anyway, because a shed door doesn't come off gentle, and nobody wanted to improvise that part in front of the girl. Patches caught the yard light one at a time, as men bent to check tire pressure, tighten saddlebags, pass a thermos hand to hand without a word about whose it was. Nobody joked. Nobody clapped anybody on the back. It was the kind of silence that comes before a funeral, not a fight, and the president had noticed that difference before, years back, in places he didn't let himself think about before coffee. The boy was on the clubhouse steps the whole time. He hadn't been told to stay there. He hadn't been told to sleep either, and clearly hadn't tried. He sat with his knees pulled up, and the photocopied paper gripped in both hands, like the cold might take it if he loosened his fingers, watching 22 grown men prepare to drive 2 counties to bring back a 9-year-old he hadn't seen in 91 days. Nobody explained the plan to him twice. He'd asked once, gotten an answer, and gone quiet after that, in the particular way of kids who have learned that asking too many questions makes adults change their minds. The president crossed the yard once, boots loud on the gravel where the others had gone quiet, and crouched in front of the steps so they were eye level. "You're not coming," he said. Not unkind, just final. The boy's jaw worked once. "I know," he said. "You did your part already." The president nodded at the paper in his hands. "You carried that for 3 months so we wouldn't have to guess." The boy looked down at it like he'd forgotten it was there, like it had become a piece of his own hand. "Bring her back with shoes on," he said. "She never has shoes on." The president stood, and behind him a truck door shut with a sound too heavy for the hour, and the yard began, at last, to move. The bikes went out in a line that had no ragged edges to it, 22 headlights cutting the dark toward Coyote Flat before the sun had decided anything about the day. He remembers that part clean, the way a man remembers the sound of his own front door, not because it was remarkable, but because he has replayed it so many times the memory has worn smooth as a creek stone. He is an old man now, standing at a gravel lot where a diner used to be, and the memory comes to him the way weather does, without asking. The fog on Route 9 that morning burned off the cracked asphalt in patches. He remembers that specifically, not gradually, not evenly, but in ragged islands that opened up ahead of the lead bike like the road itself was deciding, piece by piece, to let them through. He'd ridden that stretch 100 times before and never once looked at it the way he looked at it that morning. Headlight catching the mist as it lifted, the white going gold at the edges where the sun found it first. He remembers thinking it looked like something clearing its throat before it spoke. Behind him, the column held its shape past the county line, past the shuttered grain elevator, past the church with the sign that hadn't changed its letters in a decade. No one spoke over the radios. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said in the yard, and every man in that line understood the difference between a thing you talk through and a thing you simply do. He thinks now that the fog was the last soft thing about that morning. Everything after it turned hard-edged and specific, mile markers, turn signals, the exact number of minutes it took to cross from one county's jurisdiction into the next, as if the land itself kept better records than the people who were supposed to be protecting it. The lawyer rode in the truck near the back, papers in a soft leather satchel that had cost more than the truck itself, And even now, the president can recall the particular way the man's knuckles had gone white on the door handle, a person unused to silence being asked to sit inside it for 2 hours straight. He remembers, too, the boy's voice from the steps, small and stripped down to its essentials. Bring her back with shoes on. He had carried that sentence the whole ride, the way he'd once carried orders overseas, not comforting, not decorative, just load-bearing, something to set his jaw against when the doubt came up through his chest, like water finding a crack. The fog was gone entirely by the second county line. The road ahead ran flat and pale under a sky gone the color of dishwater, and somewhere past a stand of dead cottonwoods the property waited, unaware yet of how many engines were coming for it, and how quietly. The property announced itself before the road did, a mailbox tilted sideways, a chain-link fence patched with what looked like a box spring, and beyond it, low and gray, the shed the boy had described with such careful, rationed detail that the president had known, riding in, exactly which door it would be and which way it faced away from the house. There was a truck already parked in the yard that didn't belong to the relative. He clocked it the way he'd once clocked vehicles that didn't belong on a road in a country that wasn't his, an old instinct, unhelpful for years, suddenly useful again. A man was standing near the shed with his hand on the padlock, not opening it, just resting there, the way a man rests a hand on something to remind everyone in earshot that it's his to open or not. The convoy came to a stop the way water finds the bottom of a glass. No single engine cutting out first, all 22 going quiet within the same 3 seconds, until the only sound left was wind moving through dead cottonwoods and a dog barking somewhere behind the house, confused by the silence more than it had ever been by noise. The man at the shed turned. He was younger than the president had pictured, which surprised him, the way it always surprised him. Evil rarely wore the face memory assigned it. He had the kind of leanness that came from anger, burned as fuel rather than muscle built as labor, and his eyes went across the line of parked bikes, the way a man counts money he doesn't have. "This ain't your business," he said. Nobody answered him. 22 men sat on their bikes without dismounting, hands loose on handlebars, faces unreadable behind sunglasses and beards gone gray, and the not answering did more work than any answer could have. The lawyer stepped down from the truck last, satchel against his hip, and said the boyfriend's name and the child's names in the same even breath, followed by a case number, followed by the word custodial. And the man's jaw worked like he was chewing something he couldn't spit out and couldn't swallow. "She's not yours to hold," the president said, first words spoken since the county line. The man's hand came off the padlock, slow, testing the air the way a man tests ice. Behind him, the shed door didn't move. Nobody inside it made a sound. And the president understood, standing there with the engine ticking beneath him as it cooled, that the silence coming from that shed was the exact silence the boy had been carrying for months, patient, practiced, waiting to find out which kind of footsteps these were. The dog kept barking. The wind kept moving through the cottonwoods. And the man by the shed, counting the bikes a second time as if the number might change if he looked hard enough, finally took one step back. One step back, and then another, the gravel taking his weight unevenly, like he hadn't decided yet whether this was retreat or just repositioning. The lawyer didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He opened the folio against his forearm the way a man opens a hymnal he has read too many times to need the words, and he turned it so the boyfriend could see the seal at the top of the page without having to be handed anything, without there being any exchange between them at all. No handshake, no paper passed hand to hand, nothing that could later be called a conversation. "You can read it here," the lawyer said. "Or you can read it in front of a judge next week. Either way, it says the same thing." The boyfriend's eyes went to the page, and then away from it fast, the way a man looks away from a low sun. He wasn't reading it. He was past reading. He was counting, the president understood, counting jackets, counting years on their faces, counting the particular stillness of 22 men who had not raised a fist and did not look like they needed to. Somewhere behind them, a truck door opened and closed, unhurried, and the sound of it seemed to finish some sentence the boyfriend had been building in his own head, because his shoulders dropped half an inch, the fight going out of him the way air goes out of something already flat. "This is bullshit," he said, but there was no weight behind it. It was a thing men say when they already know they've lost, said mostly so they can tell themselves later that they said something. Nobody answered him. The president watched his hand come off the padlock the rest of the way, watched it hang there a second like it didn't know what job it had left to do, and then the man turned toward the truck parked crooked by the fence line, his own truck, and got in it without looking back at the shed, without looking at the boy standing at the tailgate of the lead bike with his knuckles white around nothing at all. The engine turned over rough, caught, and the truck pulled out onto the two-lane throwing gravel behind it, and the sound of it faded the way sounds fade in flat country, slow and complete, until there was only wind again, and the dog, quieter now, and the cottonwoods working against each other overhead. The president didn't move toward the shed yet. He stood a moment longer with his hand still resting on the warm metal of the tank, listening to that particular kind of quiet that comes after something almost happened, and did not. Then he nodded once, to no one, and started walking. The boy caught up to him before the shed, matching his stride, and neither of them said anything about the truck that had just left, or the man driving it. There was nothing left to say about him. The president let the boy get to the door first. It seemed right, somehow, that the boy's hand should be the one on the latch. The latch was simple, a hasp and an eye, no lock, just a length of wire twisted through to hold it shut, the kind of thing a man does when he wants a door closed but doesn't care enough to make it permanent. The boy's fingers worked the wire loose without hurry, like he'd done it before in the dark, by feel, learning the shape of it so he wouldn't fumble. Light came through the boards in thin gold lines, morning light, low and slatted, falling across the dirt floor in stripes that moved slightly when the cottonwoods overhead shifted in the wind. Dust hung in those stripes, turning slow. The door swung in on a hinge that complained once and then didn't. She was sitting against the far wall on a mattress that had been dragged in from somewhere else, thin, striped ticking gone gray with age, a child's sleeping bag pulled up over her knees despite the heat already building outside. A lantern stood beside her, unlit now, its glass sooted from nights of use. Canned food was stacked along the wall in a neat pyramid, the kind of order that told the president someone had been counting them, rationing them, making them last without knowing how long last needed to be. She didn't scream. She didn't move at all for a moment, just looked at the light falling through the open door, squinting against it after however many hours in the dark, and then she saw her brother's shape in the doorway before she saw the president's, and something in her face let go. "You came back," she said, and it wasn't a question. The boy crossed the dirt floor in 3 steps and knelt down in front of her, and the president stayed in the doorway, giving them the room, the way he'd learned a long time ago that some things aren't meant to be witnessed too close. She was thin, frightened still, her eyes doing that thing eyes do when they've spent too long deciding what was safe to look at. But unharmed. He said the word to himself twice. Unharmed. Testing it, needing it to be true before he let himself believe it. Behind him, out past the fence line, he heard boots in gravel, low voices, someone already radioing back down the line that they'd found her. The farmhouse door opened before anyone knocked on it. She came out slow, one hand on the frame, the housecoat hanging off her like it belonged to someone bigger, someone she used to be, gray hair pinned back without much care for how it looked. A woman built by decades of hard winters and harder men, now reduced to something the president recognized from other doorways, other years, the particular stillness of a body that has stopped fighting the thing that's killing it. She looked at the line of leather and denim coming up her drive and didn't flinch. "I figured it'd be someone," she said. Her voice had gravel in it, and underneath the gravel, relief. "Didn't know it'd be you." The president stopped a few feet off, boots planted, hands loose at his sides so she'd see he'd come with nothing but himself. "Ma'am, he know I kept them fed?" she asked, nodding toward the shed, toward the girl who was already being walked out into the light, wrapped now in someone's cut, someone's arm around her shoulders. "That's the part I want him to know. Whatever else. I kept them fed." He knows. She nodded, like that settled something old in her. Then her eyes went past him, to the men still filling up the yard, engines ticking as they cooled, and something in her face loosened the way rope loosens once the strain finally comes off it. "I'm sick," she said. Plain. The way you'd report weather. Have been for a while. Didn't have it in me to fight him off her. Not the way I should have. Didn't have it in me to call nobody either. Didn't trust who'd come. You could have called us. Didn't know you existed till he started talking about you." Her chin tipped toward the boy. "Boy talks in his sleep, some nights. Says your name like a prayer." The president said nothing to that. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have broken something in him right there in the yard, in front of 22 men who'd never seen him break. "Just see they're safe," she said. "That's all I'm asking. Don't care what happens to me. Never did care much, past a certain age. Just see they're safe. I always knew this day was coming. Man like that don't go quiet forever." She looked at the girl one more time, filed the sight of her away like a woman putting something in a drawer she didn't expect to open again, and turned back toward the house, toward whatever waited for her there alone. The president remembers that walk away longer than he remembers most things. The aunt's back going smaller against the porch boards, the screen door swallowing her whole, the way none of the 22 men moved until she was inside. Then they moved fast. 3 weeks. That's what it took. Once the lawyer had the custody paper notarized and the right names on the right forms, 3 weeks of phone calls made from the clubhouse kitchen at odd hours, of a caseworker who owed the lawyer a favor, and a judge who'd ridden with the club 20 years back before he traded his leathers for a robe. Nobody hurried it past what the law allowed. Nobody skipped a step. That mattered to him, after, that they'd done it clean. No shortcuts, no favors that would come due later in some worse currency. The placement came through the club's outer circle, the way things did when the club needed something the club itself couldn't provide. A mechanic 2 towns over, thick through the shoulders, quiet the way the boy was quiet, married to a woman who kept a garden and had buried a child of her own, 11 years back, and had a room in her house that had stayed empty since. They didn't ask for the placement. The lawyer asked them, gently, over coffee, and the mechanic's wife had cried before she said yes. The boy went first, then the girl 3 days later once the paperwork caught up to itself. The president drove them both out there himself, the boy in the truck's cab beside him not saying much, the girl asleep against the door with her thumb near her mouth the way she hadn't let herself sleep in months. He carried their bags in. He didn't stay for dinner. Some things a man doesn't get to keep for himself. The aunt died 9 weeks later. He heard about it from the lawyer, over the phone, a Tuesday evening with the shop radio going low in the next room. Something in her chest that had been there longer than the diner, longer maybe than the boyfriend, something she'd known about and never named to anyone who could have done something. She'd waited, the lawyer said. However she'd managed it, whatever she'd been holding back with her hands, she'd waited until she knew where the children had landed, before she let go of holding on. He didn't go to the funeral. He sent flowers instead, plain ones, no card, and told himself that was the right thing, though even now, years later, he isn't entirely sure it was. The mother stayed where they'd put her, a facility 2 hours south, with a name that sounded like a hotel, and wasn't. He drove down twice that first year, sat across from her in a visitor's room that smelled of bleach and vending machine coffee, and watched her hands shake around a paper cup she never drank from. She asked about the children both times. Both times he told her the truth, plainly, the way he'd tell a man about a debt owed or a job done. Still getting better, the counselors said, which he understood to mean neither better nor worse, only further from whatever had broken her, one careful day at a time. She cried the second visit. He didn't know what to do with that, so he sat until she stopped, and then he left. The diner came down in October. He heard about it secondhand, a permit filed, a crew scheduled, nothing that should have concerned him at all. He drove out anyway, parked the bike across the road, and watched 2 men in hard hats take the roof apart board by board, while a third fed the pieces into a dumpster like it was ordinary work, which it was. The counter where the boy used to sit went out in one piece, laminate cracked down the middle, and he felt something in his chest tighten that he had no name for and didn't try to find one. He went back after that more than he could account for. Not often. Not on any schedule. Some Sunday mornings he'd finish his coffee at the clubhouse and find himself on the road out of town without deciding to be, and 20 minutes later he'd be standing on gravel where a building used to stand, hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular. The lot filled in slow. Weeds first, then a chain-link fence somebody put up and nobody maintained, then a realtor's sign that faded to white by spring. He never stayed long. 10 minutes, sometimes less. Long enough to remember the smell of grease that wasn't there anymore, the boy's voice cracking on a word he hadn't meant to say, the exact color the sky had been that first morning, the kind of gray that promises rain and doesn't deliver it. He told himself he was checking on the property. He told himself a lot of things standing on that gravel, and none of them were the reason, and he was old enough now to know the difference between an excuse and a truth, even when he preferred the excuse. The truth was this. 2 years to the week after a 14-year-old boy had told him a lie about a sister who wasn't missing, he was standing on that same gravel, hands in his pockets, when he heard an engine that didn't belong to anyone in his chapter. He knew the sound before he knew why he knew it. A 400cc single, not loud, not trying to be loud, ridden by someone who'd been taught to respect a throttle instead of abuse one. He turned toward the road the way a man turns toward a name he hasn't heard in a while, half expecting to be wrong. He wasn't wrong. The boy came around the bend, past the new feed store sign, upright in the seat, hands steady on the bars, riding like it was ordinary, like it hadn't cost anything to learn. 16 now, taller than the coat he used to hide in. There was a sidecar bolted to the frame, painted the same faded green as the bike, and in it sat a girl with her hair whipping loose from a braid, both hands gripping the rail, grinning at nothing and everything, the way kids grin when the wind is doing something to them they haven't gotten tired of yet. He didn't lift a hand to wave. He just stood there and let it happen in front of him, the way you let weather happen. The bike slowed on the gravel, found a place to sit, and stopped. The boy pulled off his helmet and looked at him the way he'd looked at him from behind a diner 2 years and 40 pounds ago, steady, unhurried, no longer bracing for the next thing to be taken. "Figured you'd be here," the boy said. "Didn't figure I'd be seen. You never were as invisible as you thought." The girl in the sidecar laughed at something only she'd heard, kicked her heels against the metal, called out that she was hungry. That Sunday dinner better have the good rolls this time. The boy told her it would. He said it like a promise he'd never once had to break. The man reached into his vest, felt the worn edge of paper folded there since a morning that smelled like a diner nobody had reopened, and did not take it out. Some things you carry so you remember, some things you carry so you can put them down someday, if the day ever comes that asks for it. He looked at the boy on his own bike, the girl in the sidecar, the road running clean and empty behind them, toward everything that hadn't happened yet, and thought, not for the first time, that he had been waiting 2 years without knowing it, for exactly this. He kicked his own bike into gear, and the sound of it under him was the same sound it had always been, old iron, patient, unbothered by the years, except that today it did not feel like the loudest thing on the road. Today it felt like an answer to a question he'd stopped asking a long time ago, back when a boy behind a diner had looked at him like he expected to be lied to, or worse, believed and then abandoned anyway. He pulled out beside him, not ahead, not behind. The road took them past the feed store, past the gravel where a diner used to stand, past a stretch of fence that had been mended so many times it was more wire than post, and the girl in the sidecar sang something tuneless and happy into the wind, and the boy, 16 now, broad through the shoulders in the way boys get when someone finally starts feeding them regular, rode like he'd been doing it his whole life, instead of just since spring. There had been a morning once, when a folded piece of paper was the only true thing in a boy's pockets, and no one in 3 counties had been willing to read it. A signature, a date, a name that wasn't a stranger's. It had taken 22 men on motorcycles to make a room go quiet enough for a 14-year-old to finally believe that the paper meant what it said. Not a court, not a caseworker, just enough grown men standing still long enough for the truth to land somewhere it wouldn't get lost again. He'd carried the copy of it for 2 years now, worn soft at the folds, because a man ought to remember what it costs to be believed and what it costs a kid when he isn't. He didn't reach for it today. They rode together past the last stretch of open highway before the turn toward the clubhouse, the girl's laughter carrying back over the engine noise, the boy's hands steady on the grips, the way they'd been steady on that folded paper once, back when steady was the only thing he had left. At the gate, the boy glanced over, the way a rider checks another rider, not for permission, just for company. The man nodded once. That was all it had ever taken, really. Not a system, not a courtroom, just someone willing to slow down long enough to read what was already true and stand there afterward, so it stayed that way. He let the boy lead them in through the gate, past the flag snapping easy in the wind, toward a table already being set for Sunday, and did not think of it as an ending, only as the long middle of something that would go on now, quietly, the way the good things always do.